February 1945. A volcanic island called Jima. 8 square miles of sulfur, rock and black sand, 750 miles south of Tokyo. A Japanese officer is sitting in a prisoner stockade near the southern beach, watching something through the wire that he cannot process. 2 weeks ago, Mount Suribachi, the 550-foot volcanic cone at the southern tip of this island, had no road. It had goat paths. It had loose volcanic gravel that crumbled under a man's boot. For 20 years, the Japanese garrison had tried to build a proper road to the summit. They had used hand tools. They had used conscript labor. They had blasted rock and hauled stone and poured concrete in sections and watched typhoons wash their progress into the sea. 20 years, and they had never finished the road. The Americans had landed 14 days ago. Now, from the stockade, he can see a graded road climbing the face of Suribachi in wide, clean switchbacks. American trucks are driving up it. The road is finished. A bulldozer, one of the big American caterpillars with the blade still caked in volcanic ash, is parked at the base as if it has nothing left to do, because it doesn't. The road is done, 14 days. The officer, according to the published history of the 5th Marine Division, wept. He said, "For 20 years we tried to make a road to the top, and you did it in 2 weeks." He was not weeping about a road. He was weeping because that road had just made visible something his country's entire war plan had been built on, something that was now, in front of his eyes, collapsing. He was weeping about an assumption. The assumption was simple. It went like this. The Americans have factories, they have ships, they have aircraft, but they cannot build. Not the way building needs to happen in the Pacific, where everything is coral and jungle and volcanic rock and typhoon, and there is no cement plant within 1,000 miles, and no railroad, and no paved road, and no infrastructure of any kind. Every base the Americans need, every airfield, every supply depot, every fuel tank, every hospital, they will have to construct from raw ground on islands that have never been built on before. And that will take months. It will take months because it has always taken months. The Japanese military had been building in the Pacific for decades. They knew what it cost. They knew how long it took. They knew because they had done the work themselves with their own labor battalions on island after island across Micronesia and Melanesia. And their entire island defense strategy, the strategy that was supposed to bleed the Americans white, that was supposed to make the cost of every island so high that the invasion of the home islands would become politically unthinkable, was built on the arithmetic of time. Hold the island long enough for the garrison to inflict maximum casualties. Hold it long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Hold it long enough for the Americans to exhaust themselves building bases that would take months to become operational and that the next typhoon season might destroy anyway. That arithmetic had one variable the Japanese had not accounted for. They had not accounted for it because it did not exist when the war began. It was created in the first weeks of 1942, out of desperation, out of a bureaucratic decision made by a single rear admiral in Washington. And it was staffed not with soldiers but with the men who had built the American continent with their own hands. It was called the Naval Construction Battalions. The men who served in it called themselves, from the initials Seabee, the Seabees. And by the time that Japanese officer was weeping in a stockade on Iwo Jima, the Seabees had broken the one assumption his entire country's war strategy depended on. They had broken time. This is the story of how a force of construction workers, most of them over 30, many of them over 40, none of them trained as combat soldiers before they enlisted, built the infrastructure that won the Pacific War at a speed the Japanese military could not believe, could not match, and ultimately could not survive. To understand where the Seabees came from, you have to understand what happened on a tiny coral atoll in the Central Pacific 11 days after Pearl Harbor. Wake Island, December 23, 1941. The garrison on Wake had been holding out against Japanese naval assault for over 2 weeks, a defense so stubborn and so costly to the attackers that it had already sunk 2 Japanese destroyers and damaged a light cruiser. The Japanese had been forced to divert carrier aircraft from the returning Pearl Harbor strike force just to subdue the island. It was one of the first American stands of the war, and one of the most gallant, but Wake was not defended only by Marines. On the island were roughly 1,150 civilian construction workers employed by the Morrison-Knudsen Company, one of the largest engineering firms in the American West. They had been building an airstrip, a seaplane base, and defensive installations under a Navy contract. They were welders, electricians, heavy equipment operators, carpenters, crane operators, and surveyors. They were civilians. They had no legal right to fight. And that fact, that seemingly small legal distinction, was about to cost many of them their lives. Under international law, as it stood in 1941, a civilian who picked up a weapon against an enemy combatant could be classified as a guerrilla, an unlawful combatant, and executed on the spot. The Geneva Conventions protected soldiers. They protected men in uniform who carried their weapons openly and answered to a chain of command. They did not protect a welder from Boise, Idaho, who grabbed a rifle from a dead Marine when the Japanese came ashore in the pre-dawn darkness. And the Japanese military knew this distinction and enforced it. When Wake fell on December 23rd, the civilian workers were taken prisoner. Many of them would never come home. In October 1943, the Japanese garrison commander on Wake, Captain Shigematsu Sakaibara, ordered the execution of 98 American civilian prisoners. They were blindfolded, bound with wire, marched to the beach, and machine-gunned. One man escaped the killing. He carved the words 98 USPW 5-10-43 into a coral rock before he was recaptured and personally beheaded by Sakaibara with a katana. After the war, Sakaibara was tried by a military commission, convicted of war crimes, and hanged. The full scale of the Wake Island massacre was not known until after the war, but the vulnerability of civilian workers in combat zones was understood immediately in Washington. Civilians could not legally defend themselves. They could not be armed. They could not be ordered into danger. And yet the Navy desperately needed construction workers on every island and every base it was building across the Pacific. The solution had to be institutional. It had to be fast. 5 days after Wake fell, on December 28, 1941, Rear Admiral Ben Morrell, Chief of the Bureau of Yards and Docks and of the Civil Engineer Corps, submitted a formal request to the Bureau of Navigation. He wanted authority to recruit, organize, and militarize construction units. He wanted to take civilian builders and make them sailors. Not sailors who would man guns on a destroyer. Sailors who would pour concrete and lay steel and grade runways and string wire and dig wells, who would do everything a construction crew does on a building site in Ohio, except they would do it on a jungle island under artillery fire, and they would have the legal status of military combatants, which meant they could carry weapons and they could shoot back. On January 5, 1942, the Bureau of Navigation granted the authority. On March 5, 1942, the name was made official. Naval Construction Battalions, abbreviated Seabee, spoken as Seabees. On March 19th, Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox granted Civil Engineer Corps officers full command authority over these units, a break from long-standing naval tradition that Morrell considered one of the most important decisions of his career. Morrell, who would later become the first Staff Corps officer and the first non-Naval Academy graduate to reach 4-star rank in the United States Navy, gave them a Latin motto that captured exactly what they were in 5 syllables. Construimus, batuimus, we build, we fight. And then Morrell did something that would quietly, and without anyone recognizing it at the time, determine the outcome of the Pacific War. He went looking for men who already knew how to build. The first Seabee recruits were not young. The enlistment age range was 18 to 50, but several men over 60 managed to slip through the medical screening, and the average age in the early battalions was 37 years old. That number matters more than almost any other number in this story. 37, in 1942, meant a man who had been working with his hands since the late 1920s. It meant a man who had lived through the Great Depression, not in a breadline and not in an office, but on a job site. It meant a man who had survived the worst economic collapse in American history by doing the one thing the economy still needed done, which was building. The men who lined up at recruiting stations in the spring and summer of 1942 were the men who had literally, physically, with their own hands and their own machines, built the United States. They had built Boulder Dam, the project later renamed Hoover Dam, which was at the time of its completion the largest concrete structure on Earth. They had poured 4.5 million cubic yards of concrete in a desert canyon where summer temperatures exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit and where 96 men died during construction. They had built the highways of the emerging American road network. They had built New York City's skyscrapers, driving rivets at 800 feet above the street. They had dug subway tunnels under Manhattan and the East River. They had built shipyards on both coasts and laid pipeline across 3 time zones. Many of them had worked on the public construction projects of the New Deal, the Civilian Conservation Corps camps, the Works Progress Administration roads and bridges, the Tennessee Valley Authority dams, the massive infrastructure programs that had kept millions of men employed and the country from falling apart during the worst years of the Depression. These programs had done something that no one in Washington had intended. They had created the largest pool of trained, experienced, heavy construction workers in the history of any nation on Earth. And in 1942, Morrill dipped directly into that pool. These men knew how to operate bulldozers, motor graders, cranes, concrete mixers, asphalt plants, rock crushers, and pile drivers. They knew how to read blueprints, survey terrain with transit and level, calculate loads and bearing capacities, estimate fill volumes, rig electrical systems, weld structural steel, and improvise when the blueprint did not match the ground, which in their collective experience was most of the time. They knew these things not because anyone had taught them in a classroom. They knew them because they had learned them the way tradesmen have always learned, by doing the work, year after year, job after job, in heat and cold and rain, and every condition the American landscape could produce. When you put one of these men on a beach in the Pacific and pointed at a patch of jungle or a flat of coral and said, "I need a runway here in 4 days," he did not look at you the way a young soldier would. He did not ask whether it was possible. He had spent the last 15 years building things that other people said were impossible, in places where there was no infrastructure, no supply chain, and no margin for error. The coral under his feet was just another material. The jungle was just another site to be cleared. He looked at the ground, he estimated the grade, he calculated the fill, and he started his bulldozer. By the end of the war, roughly 325,000 men had served as Seabees. At peak strength, the force included 151 regular construction battalions, each roughly 32 officers, and 1,073 enlisted men, organized into 4 construction companies plus a headquarters unit. They also fielded 39 special battalions, 164 detachments, 136 maintenance units, 54 regiments, and 12 brigades. It was the largest military construction force ever assembled in history, and the first time it was tested under fire on a fever-ridden island in the Solomon Chain. It produced a result that set the pattern for everything that followed, and that began to dismantle the Japanese strategic timetable, one airstrip at a time. August 1942, Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. The 1st Marine Division had landed on August 7th. One of their primary objectives was a nearly completed Japanese airstrip on the north coast near Lunga Point. Japanese labor units had been building it with minimal mechanized equipment for weeks. The Marines captured it on the first day of the invasion and renamed it Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed leading a bombing run at the Battle of Midway 2 months earlier. The strip was crude, it was unpaved, it was not yet operational, and it was about to become the most important piece of real estate in the South Pacific, because whoever controlled that airfield controlled the air over the Solomon Islands. On September 1st, 1942, the 6th Naval Construction Battalion landed on Guadalcanal. They were the first Seabees to build under combat conditions anywhere in the war. What they found was a strip of packed earth approximately 2,600 feet long, surrounded by dense jungle, under daily attack from Japanese aircraft flying down from Rabaul, and under periodic naval bombardment from Japanese warships that ran what the Marines called the Tokyo Express, night convoys that shelled the airfield and landed reinforcements with impunity. The ground around the strip was littered with unexploded ordnance. The men of the 6th Battalion had arrived in a place where the distinction between construction site and battlefield did not exist. Their job was to make Henderson Field operational, and keep it operational regardless of what the Japanese did to it. Every day, Japanese bombers from Rabaul, flying the 600-mile round trip called the Slot, cratered the runway. Every night, Japanese cruisers and destroyers shelled the airfield from offshore. And every morning, before the first light was strong enough to read a survey stake, the Seabees of the 6th Battalion filled the craters, relaid the surface, replaced the damaged mast and matting, and got the fighters back in the air. The technology that made this possible had a name that does not sound dramatic, but that was, in practical terms, one of the most important engineering innovations of the entire war. It was called Marston matting, also known as pierced steel planking, named after Marston, North Carolina, where it was first tested at an Army airfield. Each panel was 10 feet long and 15 inches wide. It weighed approximately 66 pounds. It was punched with 87 holes that served two purposes: draining rainwater through the surface and reducing the weight of each panel so that two men could carry one. The panels hooked and slotted together in a staggered, interlocking pattern, like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle laid flat, and could be placed over any reasonably level surface. Crushed coral, packed earth, graded sand, leveled clay. The result was an instant hard surface runway that could support the weight of a fully loaded fighter or bomber. A small, experienced crew could lay a strip 200 feet wide and 5,000 feet long in approximately 2 days. By the end of the war, roughly 2 million tons of Marston matting had been manufactured in American steel plants, consuming enough raw steel to build approximately 600 Liberty ships. It was shipped across the Pacific in the holds of cargo vessels, stacked on beaches by shore parties, and laid by Seabees, who had become so fast at the work that the process looked, to observers, almost mechanical. Panel, hook, lock, step forward. Panel, hook, lock, step forward. Mile after mile of instant runway unrolling across the Pacific. On Guadalcanal, the Seabees took Marston matting and turned bomb crater repair into a science. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Blunden, the officer in charge of the 6th Battalion, reported that 100 Seabees could repair the damage of a 500-pound bomb hit on an airstrip in 40 minutes. 40 minutes. They pre-positioned repair stations along the runway, each one stocked with roughly 1,600 square feet of replacement matting, which was the amount needed to fill and cover a 500-pound bomb crater, along with preloaded trucks filled with sand and gravel for fill. When the bombs hit, the repair crews moved before the dust had settled. Fill the hole. Compact the fill. Lay the matting. Lock it down. Clear the strip. 40 minutes. The Japanese were flying 3-hour round trips from Rabaul to crater a runway that was repaired and operational before their aircraft had landed back at base. They were pouring bombs into a hole that filled itself faster than they could empty it. It was, from the Japanese perspective, like trying to stop a river by throwing stones. On October 3, 1942, during a Japanese strafing run on Henderson Field, Seaman Second Class Lawrence Meyer of the 6th Battalion saw a Japanese Zero making a low pass along the strip. Meyer grabbed a salvaged machine gun that was not part of any assigned anti-aircraft position, took aim, and shot the aircraft down. 13 days later, Meyer was killed when the gasoline barge he was working on was struck by Japanese naval gunfire during one of the Tokyo Express bombardments. He was awarded the Silver Star posthumously. He had been a construction worker from the American Midwest. He had never been trained as an anti-aircraft gunner. He saw the plane. He saw the gun. He made the decision. The 6th Naval Construction Battalion earned the Presidential Unit Citation for its service on Guadalcanal, the first of 4 Seabee battalions to receive that honor in the war. But even before Guadalcanal, the Seabees had demonstrated what they could do in conditions that should have made construction impossible. In the summer of 1942, with the Japanese building their own airstrip on Guadalcanal, American commanders faced an urgent problem. They needed a base close enough to Guadalcanal to launch bombing raids against the Japanese position before the Japanese airstrip became operational. If the Japanese finished first, they would have air superiority over the Southern Solomons, and the planned marine landings on Guadalcanal would face air attack from the moment the transports appeared on the horizon. The race to finish an airfield first was, in a very real sense, the race that would determine whether the Guadalcanal campaign happened at all. The Americans found their sight on Espiritu Santo, an island in the New Hebrides chain, roughly 500 miles southeast of Guadalcanal. A detachment of the 1st Naval Construction Battalion, working alongside Marines, Army infantry, and local laborers, was given orders to carve a functional airfield out of raw, unbroken tropical jungle. The resources they had to do it with were, by any normal engineering standard, laughable. They had 6 tractors. They had 2 scrapers. They had virtually no other heavy equipment, no graders, no rock crushers, no asphalt plant. The terrain was dense tropical forest with hardwood trees over 100 feet tall, root systems that went 6 feet deep and tangled into mats of wood that had to be ripped out of the ground by brute mechanical force, and undergrowth so thick that a man with a machete could clear approximately 10 feet in an hour. A military engineering manual would have said the job was impossible with the available equipment. The Seabees did not consult the manual. They felled the trees. They dragged the stumps. They graded the earth with what they had. They improvised drainage. They compacted the surface. And they built a 6,000-foot airstrip in 20 days. The first American fighters landed on July 28, 1942. 17 heavy bombers landed the following day. The strip at Turtle Bay, Espiritu Santo, became one of the critical staging bases for the entire Guadalcanal campaign. The bombers that hit the Japanese positions on Guadalcanal in the early days of the battle flew from a runway that had been jungle 3 weeks earlier, built by a handful of men with 6 tractors, and a refusal to accept that the job could not be done. That refusal was not bravado. It was professional habit. These were men who had spent 15 years being told that jobs could not be done and then doing them anyway. A foreman on a Depression-era dam project did not have the luxury of saying it could not be built. It had to be built. The budget was fixed, the schedule was fixed, and the men needed the work. You figured it out. You used what you had. You improvised. And when the ground did not cooperate, you made the ground cooperate. The Seabees brought that mentality to the Pacific the way other men brought their kit bags. It was not something they had been issued. It was something they were. The pattern that emerged from these early operations, the pattern of impossible speed, of construction under fire, of men who treated a bombing raid as a scheduling inconvenience rather than a reason to stop working, repeated itself across the Pacific for the next 3 years, and each time it repeated, the gap between what the Japanese expected and what actually happened grew wider. November 1943. Bougainville, Solomon Islands, Cape, Torokina. When the 3rd Marine Division landed on November 1st, the Seabees went in with them on the assault beaches. The 25th, 53rd, 71st, and 75th Naval Construction Battalions. The terrain at Torokina was among the worst the Seabees had encountered. The ground was a volcanic swamp. The soil could swallow a man to his waist. The jungle canopy was so dense that aerial photographs were nearly useless for site planning. Rainfall was measured in feet per month. Japanese snipers operated within earshot of the construction zones, and artillery fire from Japanese positions inland interrupted work daily. American planners had estimated that the Japanese would need roughly 3 months to mount a serious counterattack against the Torokina beachhead, based on intelligence about the size and disposition of Japanese forces at Rabaul. The Seabees did not have 3 months. They had weeks. The 71st Battalion began clearing ground for the Torokina fighter strip on November 10th. By December 10th, exactly 30 days later, the strip was operational. 18 F-4U Corsairs of Marine Fighter Squadron. 216 landed that day. The Piva bomber strip and a second fighter strip followed in quick succession, both operational by early January 1944. In the space of 8 weeks, the Seabees had carved 3 functional combat airfields out of equatorial swamp under direct enemy fire, in conditions that Japanese military planners would not have considered possible using their own construction methods and timetables. General Hitoshi Imamura, commanding the Japanese 8th Area Army at Rabaul, studied the reports from Torokina and concluded that the American beachhead was a temporary position, a stepping stone the Americans would use briefly and then abandon. He did not commit the full weight of his garrison to crush the beachhead in its first vulnerable weeks. He waited. He was repeating, as the official United States Army history observes, the era of Guadalcanal. He was making strategic decisions based on a timetable that assumed the Americans could not build fast enough to stay permanently. The Americans, who were not reading his intelligence estimates, had already stayed. The airfields were built. The fighters were flying. The window to destroy the beachhead had closed before Imamura recognized it had been open. In the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, interrogations conducted in Tokyo after the surrender, Japanese officers described a pattern that matched this miscalculation across the entire Pacific. Commander Chikataka Nakajima summarized the post-Solomons strategy as placing almost complete reliance on island garrisons to make the American westward advance slow and costly. He acknowledged that American moves had repeatedly come faster than anticipated, that the assault on the Marianas, for example, had arrived before Japanese air strength in those islands had reached the planned levels. Captain Watanabe of Admiral Yamamoto's staff described the expectation that garrisons could hold positions for months without reinforcement, buying time for the Empire to consolidate its defensive perimeter. The expectation was reasonable. It was based on sound military logic. It simply did not account for the Seabees. The gap between the Japanese timetable and the American one was not closing. It was widening with every island the Americans took. At Guadalcanal, the Japanese had expected months. The Seabees gave them weeks. At Bougainville, the Japanese had expected weeks before the beachhead became permanent. The Seabees gave them days. At Saipan, the Japanese had expected the captured airfield to be unusable for weeks. The Seabees had it operational in 4 days. The pattern was consistent, and it was accelerating. Each time the Japanese drew a line on their strategic calendar and said, "We have this much time before the Americans can project air power from this position." The Seabees erased the line and redrew it weeks or months closer to the present. By 1945, at Okinawa, the gap between the Japanese estimate and the American reality had collapsed to 4 days. The entire defensive strategy of the Japanese Empire was being outpaced by men with bulldozers. Every like on this video is a small thing, but it keeps the story of men like Lawrence Meyer and the thousands of Seabees whose names never made the history books visible a little longer. That matters. And then came the moment that the title of this investigation refers to, the moment that compressed the entire Seabee story into a single number. April 1st, 1945, Okinawa, L-Day, the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War. More than 180,000 troops in the combined expeditionary force hitting the beaches of an island just 340 miles from the Japanese home islands. Among the forces landing that morning were multiple Seabee battalions with orders to get airfields operational as fast as the situation on the ground would allow. What happened next was documented in the Bureau of Yards and Docks' own wartime publication, the Seabee News Service, issue 70, dated May 1st, 1945. The headline read, "Okinawa Airfield took 4 days." 4 days. The first airfield on Okinawa was ready for operation 4 days after the Seabees landed on D-Day. The same bulletin noted that at Jima, the first field had been ready 7 days after the Navy construction men went ashore, but Okinawa was 4. 4 days from boots on the beach to American aircraft rolling down the runway. Think about what that means from the Japanese side. Japanese planning for the defense of Okinawa, under the command of Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima of the 32nd Army, was built entirely around the weapon of delay. The plan was to withdraw into the fortified limestone ridges and caves of the southern third of the island and fight a grinding battle of attrition that would make the American casualty rate unbearable. Time was the weapon. Every day that Ushijima's forces held out was a day the Americans did not have full land-based air superiority operating from Okinawa's own strips. Every day was a day the kamikaze aircraft could operate at shorter range against the American fleet anchored offshore, where the Navy was taking devastating losses. The assumption, built into every layer of the Japanese defensive plan, was that converting captured or damaged Japanese airfields into fully operational American ones would take weeks at a minimum. The 4-day airfield shattered that assumption so completely that the timetable the entire defense was built on became meaningless. The same thing had happened at Saipan 10 months earlier, in June 1944. When the Marines captured Aslito airfield on the southern coast, the 18th and 121st Naval Construction Battalions moved in immediately behind the assault troops. They filled craters, cleared Japanese wreckage and shrapnel, leveled damaged taxiways, and resurfaced the mile-long runway. The first American aircraft landed just 2 days later. The strip was fully operational within 4 days. The Seabees also rebuilt a wrecked Japanese rail line that ran from the shore to the airfield, restoring it in 4 days. Japanese planners had calculated weeks. They received days. The arithmetic of their defense was wrong, and by the time they understood how wrong it was, American aircraft were already flying missions from the strips they had expected to be unusable. To understand why the Japanese could not match this speed, you have to look past the battlefield and into the factories and the fields and the construction sites of 2 very different civilizations. The gap between American and Japanese military construction was not a gap in courage or commitment. It was a gap in industrial capacity and cultural practice. The American Seabees arrived on every island with fleets of heavy mechanized equipment that had no Japanese equivalent. Bulldozers, motor graders, power shovels, dump trucks, concrete mixers, asphalt batch plants, rock crushers, and vibratory rollers, all manufactured in American factories that were outproducing Japan in steel by a ratio so large that comparison was nearly pointless. The Seabees also arrived with mast and matting, millions of panels of it, pre-manufactured in American steel plants, shipped across the Pacific in the holds of Liberty ships, stacked on beaches by shore parties, and laid across coral in hours. They arrived with engineering manuals, precision survey equipment, portable generators, electric welding rigs, and men who could operate every piece of this machinery because they had been operating it for 20 years in civilian life. The Japanese military, by contrast, built with labor, manual human labor. On island after island across the Pacific, Japanese airfields and fortifications had been constructed by labor battalions using hand tools, picks, shovels, baskets, and human backs, supplemented in many locations by forced labor drawn from prisoners of war and subject populations. On Palawan in the Philippines, American prisoners of war had been forced to fell trees, carry and hand-crush coral, and pour concrete under a regime of systematic beatings. A survivor named Daniel Crowley later testified to what the work was like. "You worked, or you were beaten." On Guadalcanal, the airfield the Marines captured had been built by Japanese labor units using minimal heavy equipment. The Japanese had abandoned intact construction machinery when the Marines took Lunga Point, machinery they could not easily replace. The disparity was not merely technological. It ran deeper. It was industrial. It was cultural. It was historical. The United States was a country that had spent more than a century building with machines. The bulldozer was not a military invention adopted by civilians. It was a civilian invention adopted by the military. It was developed in the 1920s and 30s for American construction companies that needed to move earth at speeds no crew of men with shovels could match. By 1942, the United States had more heavy construction equipment in private, civilian hands than most nations had in their entire military inventories combined. When the Seabees were formed, the men who enlisted already knew how to run a Caterpillar because they had been running Caterpillars on highway projects in Nebraska and dam sites in Washington state and mining operations in Montana for 15 years. The man and the machine arrived in the Pacific as a matched set. The Japanese had no equivalent. Their economy had prioritized the construction of warships, aircraft, and weapons. It had not invested in the mass production of civilian bulldozers and graders and power shovels, because Japanese construction, like Japanese agriculture, still relied fundamentally on human muscle. When a Japanese garrison commander needed an airfield on a Pacific island, he built it the way construction had always been done in Japan, with men, with shovels, with baskets of earth and stone carried on shoulders, and it took months. When the Americans needed the same airfield, they built it the way construction had been done in America for a generation, with machines, with mast and matting, with crushed coral compacted by mechanical rollers, and it took days. The Japanese strategic calculation was never foolish. It was never based on ignorance. It was based on their own deep experience of what construction in the Pacific actually required. They had simply never encountered, and had no reason to have anticipated, an industrial civilization that had turned heavy construction into a mechanized, standardized, mass production process, the same way it had turned automobile manufacturing into one, and that had then put the men who operated that process into uniform and shipped them across the ocean with their own equipment and their own expertise intact. These men did not merely build, they fought. The Seabees were trained by the Marines in basic infantry tactics, and the stories of Seabees setting down their tools and picking up weapons are not folklore. They are documented and decorated. October 27, 1943. The Treasury Islands, south of Bougainville, Mono Island. A Seabee named Aurelio Tassone, of the 87th Naval Construction Battalion, was operating a D-8 Caterpillar bulldozer near the beach when his unit came under fire from a fortified Japanese pillbox, blocking the American advance. Inland, Tassone did not abandon his bulldozer. He did not look for a foxhole. He raised the blade as a steel shield, put the machine in gear, drove it directly at the fortified position while Lieutenant Charles Turnbull ran alongside giving covering fire with his carbine, and crushed the pillbox and its 12 defenders under the blade and the treads of a piece of civilian construction equipment. Tassone received the Silver Star. The incident was so dramatic that it became one of the inspirations for the 1944 Hollywood film The Fighting Seabees, starring John Wayne. But Tassone was not unusual. He was typical of something the Seabees represented. These were men who solved problems with whatever tool was closest to their hand. If the tool was a bulldozer, they used the bulldozer. If the tool was a rifle, they used the rifle. If the tool was scrap steel from a wrecked beach obstacle and a welding torch, and an idea that came to them at 3 a.m, they used that. In the Second World War, Seabees earned 5 Navy Crosses, 33 Silver Stars, and more than 2,000 Purple Hearts. Approximately 272 enlisted men and 18 officers were killed in action. Hundreds more died in construction accidents, from tropical disease, and from the accumulated toll of working 18-hour days in equatorial heat on islands where malaria and dengue fever were as dangerous as Japanese artillery. On Iwo Jima, the 31st, 62nd, and 133rd Naval Construction Battalions landed with the Marines in February 1945 on beaches of black volcanic sand, so soft that vehicles sank to their axles and men sank to their knees. The island was still an active volcanic zone. The ground in places was hot to the touch, steam vented from cracks in the rock. The Japanese had spent years fortifying the island with an underground network of tunnels, bunkers, and artillery positions that made every square yard of the surface a potential kill zone. The 133rd Naval Construction Battalion suffered severe casualties on Iwo Jima, between 245 and 328, depending on the Navy source, the highest of any Seabee unit in the entire war. These were construction workers, men whose tools were shovels and bulldozers and welding torches, taking casualties at rates that would have been considered severe for a frontline infantry battalion. They did not stop working. They could not stop working. Every hour that an airfield remained unfinished was an hour that damaged B-29 bombers returning from raids over Japan had nowhere to make an emergency landing. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Get the strip open and save flight crews. Fail to get the strip open and those crews ditch in the ocean and drown. The Seabees understood the equation. They worked through the shelling. Marine fighter pilots began using the Seabee repaired southern airfield on February 26th, less than a week after the initial landings, and while the battle for the island was still raging. By the end of the campaign, the airfields on Iwo Jima would serve as emergency landing strips for B-29 bombers returning damaged from raids over Japan. By widely cited wartime estimates, more than 2,200 B-29s made landings on the island, many of them emergency diversions that saved crews who would otherwise have ditched in the open ocean. The 31st Battalion built the road up Suribachi that the Japanese prisoner wept about. They built it because the road was needed, and they were the men who built things that were needed, and they did not require any more reason than that. The thing I want you to hold on to about these men is the same thing that Japanese officer in the stockade could not reconcile. These were not elite troops. They were not commandos. They were not young men at the peak of physical fitness selected for their aggression and their speed. They were middle-aged construction workers, electricians from Philadelphia, steel workers from Pittsburgh, heavy equipment operators from Portland, plumbers from New Jersey, carpenters from East Texas, men who had families and mortgages and bad knees and reading glasses, men who had been too old for the draft in many cases and had volunteered anyway because they had a skill the country needed, and they were not the kind of men who sat at home when there was a job to be done. If your father or grandfather served in the Seabees, or if anyone in your family was part of a naval construction battalion in any theatre of the war, I would be honoured to read their story in the comments. What battalion? What island? What did they build? What did the old man say about it once at a kitchen table and then never mention again? Those details, the small, specific, personal ones, are the actual record of what happened. They deserve to be preserved by the people who carry them. The speed at which the Seabees could build did not merely win individual battles. It restructured the strategic architecture of the entire Pacific War. The American strategy of island hopping, the grand concept of seizing certain islands and bypassing others, leaving isolated Japanese garrisons to wither without supply until they starved or surrendered, depended entirely on one capability that no strategy briefing in Washington could create by itself. It depended on the ability to turn a captured island into an operational airbase, fast enough to project power to the next target before the enemy could regroup. Without that capability, island hopping was a line drawn on a map in a conference room. With it, the line became a road, and the Seabees paved it. Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur both understood that the Seabees were not a support element in the way that word is usually understood. They were the enabling condition for the entire Pacific campaign. The aircraft that won air superiority over island after island flew from Seabee-built strips. The bombers that severed Japanese supply lines and reduced Japanese garrisons to starvation flew from Seabee-built strips. The fighters that provided cover for every amphibious landing from Tarawa to Okinawa flew from Seabee-built strips. The reconnaissance aircraft that photographed enemy positions before each assault flew from Seabee-built strips. Without those strips, the Pacific Fleet's aircraft carriers would have had to bear the entire burden of providing air power for every operation, an unsustainable strain on ships that needed periodic rotation for maintenance and resupply. The Seabees made land-based air power possible at every step of the advance, and land-based air power was the foundation on which everything else, the naval bombardments, the amphibious assaults, the logistics convoys, depended. In the Pacific theater alone, the Seabees constructed 111 major airstrips, 441 piers, 2,558 ammunition magazines, 700 square blocks of warehouses, hospitals with beds for 70,000 patients, fuel storage capacity for 100 million gallons, and barracks and housing for 1.5 million men. Across all theaters of the war, they built more than 400 bases. The total cost of Seabee construction was nearly $11 billion, a sum that in today's terms would represent well over $100 billion. Every dollar of it was spent creating the physical infrastructure without which the Pacific War could not have been fought at the pace it was fought, and could not have been won when it was won. But the single construction project that connects every Seabee who ever laid a panel of mast and matting to the final act of the war was not a road on a volcano and not a fighter strip in a swamp. It was an entire island, rebuilt from the ground up into the largest airfield the world had ever seen. Tinian, a small island in the Mariana Chain, roughly 12 miles long and 5 miles wide, 100 miles north of Guam. The Japanese had seized it from Germany during the First World War and administered it under a League of Nations mandate since 1920. They had cultivated sugarcane on its flat terrain and built a modest airstrip at the northern tip called Ushi Point. When the Marines secured Tinian on August 1, 1944, after a 9-day battle, the Seabees began moving in before the last Japanese positions on the island had been cleared. The 6th Naval Construction Brigade, under Captain Paul Halloran, with the 29th, 30th, and 49th Naval Construction Regiments, began a transformation that would turn a sugarcane island into the most important piece of military real estate on Earth. What they accomplished in the months that followed is difficult to convey without numbers, and the numbers themselves are difficult to believe. They built Northfield, 4 parallel runways, each approximately 8,500 feet long, wide enough and strong enough to handle the heaviest aircraft in the American inventory, the fully loaded B-29 Superfortress, which weighed over 60 tons when carrying a full bomb load and fuel for the 3,000-mile round trip to Japan. Each runway required grading, drainage engineering, compaction, and surfacing to standards that would have been considered rigorous for a peacetime commercial airport. The Seabees blasted coral limestone from quarries they opened on the island, crushed it in portable rock crushing plants they had shipped across the Pacific, hauled it to the runway sites in convoys of dump trucks, spread it, graded it, and compacted it with heavy rollers until the surface could bear the repeated stress of 60-ton aircraft landing and taking off around the clock. They surfaced critical sections with mast and matting where the coral base alone was not sufficient. They built taxiways connecting the 4 runways to hundreds of individual hardstands where B-29s could be parked, armed, fueled, and maintained simultaneously. They built maintenance hangars, bomb assembly buildings, aviation fuel storage for millions of gallons, ammunition magazines, mess halls for thousands of men, barracks, a full base hospital, water purification plants, electrical generating stations, and a communications center. They also built West Field, a second major airfield on the southern part of the island, with additional runways and facilities. No single runway on Tinian required more than 53 days to construct from raw ground to full operational status. The Seabees laid out the island's road grid with the precision and the humor of men who had once built cities on the American mainland. They named the roads after the streets of Manhattan. Broadway ran the length of the island, 8th Avenue crossed it, 42nd Street, Wall Street, and Riverside Drive filled in the grid. The men who had helped build the real versions of those streets in New York in the 1920s and 30s were now constructing their Pacific equivalents out of crushed coral and volcanic earth on an island that, 3 months earlier, had been a Japanese sugarcane plantation. By early 1945, North Field, Tinian, was the busiest and largest operational airfield on the planet, home to the 313th Bombardment Wing and the permanent base of the 509th Composite Group, the unit tasked with the most closely guarded secret of the war. On the morning of August 6, 1945, a B-29 superfortress, named the Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, taxied down runway Able at North Field, Tinian, and lifted off into the pre-dawn darkness for a city called Hiroshima. The runway beneath the wheels of that aircraft had been built by Seabees. 3 days later, on August 9th, another B-29 named Boxcar departed the same field for Nagasaki. The runway beneath that aircraft had also been built by Seabees. Physicist Philip Morrison, who helped assemble the weapon on Tinian, later described what the Seabees had created on that island as one of the most remarkable construction achievements of the war, noting that the United States Armed Forces had built the largest airport in the world on a Pacific island that most Americans could not have found on a map. The weapons that ended the Second World War were delivered by aircraft that flew from runways, poured and graded and matted by men who, 3 years earlier, had been building highways in Nebraska and dams in Oregon and bridges in Pennsylvania. The direct, physical connection between a welder's calloused hands and the end of the deadliest conflict in human history runs through Tinian, through the crushed coral and Marston matting and compacted volcanic gravel that the Seabees put down, one strip at a time, under schedule, under fire, because that was what they did. It was what they had always done. The material changed. The urgency changed. The skill was the same. So here is the answer to the question this investigation opened with. Why could Japanese commanders not believe that the Americans built an airfield in 4 days? They could not believe it because their entire strategy for fighting the Pacific War was founded on the assumption that it was impossible, not unlikely, not improbable, impossible. The Japanese military knew how long it took to build an airfield on a Pacific island. They had been doing it for decades. They knew the soil conditions on coral atolls. They knew the drainage problems in volcanic terrain. They knew the supply requirements for concrete and steel and lumber on islands that had none of these materials locally. They knew the labor demands, the vulnerability to weather, and the engineering challenges of building runways on ground that might be 20 feet of sand over a coral reef or a layer of volcanic ash over sulfur vents. They knew all of this because they had done the work themselves with their own labor battalions on island after island, from the Marshalls to the Marianas to the Solomons. A proper runway, by their experience, took months of sustained effort by hundreds of men. This was not poor intelligence. This was not a failure of imagination on the part of a few unimaginative staff officers. This was a deeply informed assessment, based on decades of practical construction experience in exactly the terrain the war was being fought on, and it was completely wrong. What they did not know, what their intelligence apparatus had no category for and their operational experience gave them no framework to anticipate, was that the Americans were not building the way anyone in history had ever built in the Pacific before. They were not building with labor. They were building with an industrial system. A system that started in the steel mills of Pittsburgh and the Caterpillar factories of Peoria, Illinois, flowed through the cargo holds of Liberty ships across 8,000 miles of ocean, landed on a beach in the form of bulldozers and motor graders and portable rock crushers and pre-manufactured steel planking, and was operated by men who had spent their entire working lives building difficult things in difficult places in a country that had turned heavy construction into a mechanized, standardized, mass production discipline. The 40-minute bomb crater repair on Guadalcanal, the 20-day jungle airstrip on Espiritu Santo, the 4-day operational runway on Okinawa. None of these were miracles. None of them were accidents. They were the products of a system, and the system was the accumulated industrial and human capital of a nation that had been building at mechanized scale for 50 years. The Japanese officer at Iwo Jima who wept and said, "For 20 years we tried and you did it in 2 weeks," was not describing a difference in effort or willpower or courage. Japanese construction workers and laborers worked with extraordinary physical endurance, often under conditions of deprivation that would have stopped most men. The difference was not human, it was civilizational. It was the difference between an economy built on manual labor and an economy built on mechanical power. It was the difference between a construction tradition that moved earth with baskets on shoulders and a construction tradition that moved earth with machines that could do the work of 100 men in an hour. And it was the difference between an army that had to train its builders and a navy that had simply recruited men who already were builders and handed them a set of blueprints and a deadline. Rear Admiral Ben Moriel, the man who created the Seabees, understood something in January of 1942 that the Japanese Empire would not fully grasp until it was far too late. He understood that the Pacific War would not be decided only by the navy that could sink the most ships or the air force that could shoot down the most planes. It would be decided by the nation that could build the fastest. Every island was a construction project. Every beachhead was a building site. Every advance in the long chain from Guadalcanal to Okinawa depended on the runway that came after the fighting, the strip that turned a captured piece of coral into an unsinkable aircraft carrier, the base that allowed the next wave of bombers to reach the next target and keep the chain moving forward. Most of the men who built those runways went home after the war and never spoke about it much. They went back to building. They poured the foundations for the Levitt towns and the new suburban developments that spread across the country in the late 1940s and 50s. They paved the roads of the emerging interstate highway system. They built hospitals and schools and water treatment plants, and the infrastructure of a post-war America that was expanding faster than any economy in history. They used the same skills on those peacetime jobs that they had used on Tinian and Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima. The difference was that nobody was shelling them while they worked, and nobody was handing them medals when they finished. They did not think of themselves as heroes. They thought of themselves as what they had always been, builders. Men who looked at a piece of ground and saw not what it was, but what it could become, and who then made it become that, with their hands and their machines and their quiet, stubborn, professional certainty that no job was truly impossible if you had the right equipment and the right crew and enough determination. Even if the job was on a volcanic island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and even if enough time turned out to be 4 days. If this investigation gave you something to think about, hit that subscribe button. There are many more stories like this one. Stories about ordinary men who never gave famous speeches and never fired famous shots, but who built the ground that everything else in this war stood on. The Seabees knew something that most history books forget. You can have the finest army in the world, the most advanced aircraft, and the most brilliant strategy ever drawn on a map, but without a runway, none of it leaves the ground. We build, we fight. That was the motto, but the building always came first. And the men who did it, the men who were too old and too skilled and too stubborn to do anything except look at a piece of impossible ground and start their engines, they built the road to victory in the Pacific, 4 days at a time.